So I, like many, have been watching the SLI Star Series tournament this week going on in Kiev, Ukraine. And one of the teams that I've been watching out for in their particular performance metrics have been Mouse Sports. As of right now, they're currently in round 4 playing against Liquid. I think this is a decider match to go through to the playoffs. Currently in overtime on the first map, so I'm keeping my track of them, and that's as of this video being recorded. And it got me thinking really about one of the key players for Mouse Sports at the moment. And that key player is Sunny. Sunny came from a roster before this called Penta Sports, and Penta Sports was is a team and organization that's been around the Counter-Strike scene for a very, very long time, have a lot of history, and with Sunny's own personal history with Penta Sports and the roster that he had before that, it kind of got me thinking about the way that the current scene would be right now if Penta didn't have their untimely demise back at the end of 2017. And I feel like there's an alternative reality to ours right now, where Mouse Sports aren't quite as far as they are right now, but Penta Sports are among sort of like that top 10 region instead. And this is what this video is going to be talking about: why that would have been the case, how Sunny has been impactful to that. Not necessarily so much Sunny himself, but how this could all be the case, and why I feel like Penta had a lot of potential towards the end of their run. And of course, we'll start that with the run itself and the history behind Penta, the roster. We'll start at the beginning. It's a very good place to start. So let's talk about the history of Penta as a whole. They used to be a German team. They are a German organization after all. And after the old roster, before their reformed international roster, they had crumbled around them. The whole team had just crumbled around the organization after basically some subpart to very, very poor results. Started with Tamsin, who left the team to get picked up by Energy Esports instead. Lowell got picked up by Mouse Sports, and this is going to be a key theme about the way that these teams have kind of met their demise. Mouse Sports has always seems to pick up some sort of player from Penta Sports at some point, and Lowell was one of those transactions, and he played for Mouse Sports, a subpar Mouse Sports team, not part of the team now, but it's kind of where it all started for him in moving from Penta to Mouse Sports. Tarsin went on to get released from his contract and play for Berserk in the end, which is a lower tier German team. And Mike was the final man on Penta, who just kind of left and never really rejoined another CSGO team. So what that left us with was Crystal, who has been with the Penta Esports lineup and the Penta Esports organization since 2014, and Stefan, who they recruited on a trial basis but hadn't officially picked up. So only one solid member of Penta right now, and Crystal had this major issue with him. He had to rebuild the entire lineup, essentially, of this organization off his own back and figure out where they were going to go from there. And they started off by picking off a really big man, of course, the man that we were talking about at the top of the video, Sunny himself. Already prior to this point, he was making his way up through the Finnish team. He was part of a roster called Penta Esports, fully Finnish, and he won basically with that roster, they won a handful of Nordic championships and attended the EU minor for Atlanta 2017, which is pretty significant for a Finnish team because basically Finland is not really one of those like countries that are known for their national star rosters. You've got Sweden, who've had their Fanatics and their NIPs, and their Denmark who've had their Astralis and Norths, etc. So you don't really see that from Finland. So that's a pretty decent achievement for someone like Ents, who aren't necessarily one of the main staple organizations. So Sunny went from Ents to Penta to kick things off. So we've got two mainstay players, and Stefan still on trial. After Stefan was basically decided, it was decided that Stefan couldn't go into full time with Penta. So Penta decided to drop him and make a move to an international roster, and they signed 3 players for it. The first was Zen, who had previously been a part of iGame, another Finnish roster, placed top 3 at the WCA World Finals in 2017, and played at, 2016 I should say, and played at the WESG Lad and went to top 8 overall. So pretty decent record of tournaments. WESG and WCA definitely aren't the world majors, but they are internationally represented, and they have some very, very good teams and very, very high level competition at them. So Zen is probably one of the more achieved players, I think, of this entire roster at this point in time. HS was the 4th man, played on the Rogue EU roster before its collapse, and then that Rogue roster never made any major achievements, but then again, the whole roster was a bit of a fail anyway. And then they've got Innocent, who prior to this was just benched from Team Kingwin during a period where Kingwin and other Polish teams just were living in the shadow of Virtus Pro, and this was towards the end of 2016, which we know was the major rise of VP, where where they were at that time the best team in the world. Obviously, these days things are completely different. And as a result, Kingwin weren't able to do much in this particular period. Innocent dropped from the roster. They went with, I believe it was Mihu as well. I can't remember specifically, but that's another video for another day. So, what we end up having on Penta is 3 parts of a proven roster and 2 parts that have been completely unproven. On paper, that doesn't show when you look at that on paper, it doesn't show you a whole lot, and only really just shows you that there's a little bit of potential. How much potential really depends on how well this roster is able to slot together and how well each teammate and each player is complementing the roster playstyle as a whole. And that's something that people were quite eyeing up in 2017, because when this roster was announced, when Penta said, okay, this is what we're going to be sporting now for the rest of the year, this kind of sparked up a little bit of information and a little bit of knowledge from various different pundits. I definitely remember Thorin was tweeting about it at the time. A couple other casters and analysts were looking at this roster like, okay, this has quite a bit of potential, and actually I'm quite interested to see how well they do. And so was I. In fact, I casted one of their first matches in the Razor Rising Stars League, which at the time I was working under EFrag. I was working under that sort of guys. It was one of my first major international gigs, and that was I think one of the first few matches I casted. It was a best of 2, and it was against Space Soldiers. And Space Soldiers at this time were known as one of the best tier 2 teams out there, and it was a Turkish team that never really broke into the tier 1 professional league sort of level of play. But when it came to tier 2, their aggression and their overall, not only just their aggression, but their T-side aggression and their CT side tenacity was one that proved to be extremely painful to any team in the tier 2 scene that they faced up against. And it was a very interesting time to watch them, because you'd often pick them to win unless they were up against one of the higher tier teams. So to see them going up against Penta was a major challenge for Penta overall. But Penta was actually the team that came out on top. In fact, it was a pure dismantling of the Space Soldiers. The first map was Cash. Penta won 16-6. And then the second map was Train, where Penta won 16-9. It was absolute destruction from the Penta side, as they just picked apart the Space Soldiers so easily. And I honestly was not expecting this at all. I was so surprised and impressed at Penta's performance. Me and Herald at the time were sort of like discussing, deliberating during the pre-match, just sort of like, yeah, this could be a good roster, but we've got to see whether they can prove themselves. And lo and behold, they did. They proved themselves in 2 maps, and just by off the debate of that, I became an instant fan. This would be the start of very good online results. Very amazing online results for the Penta side. Their debut finish at a tournament was at the Binary Dragons CSGO, the first CSGO Cup for the Binary Dragons. Not a major tournament, but still had a good number of reputable teams. I do believe that for a new roster, it's a very good proving ground at that kind of a level. And they finished in second place against Space Soldiers in a best of 3. It was still 2-1, so Space Soldiers got the upper hand in them in that case, but they still have those wins. And from there, it just kind of steamrolled onto so many different online placements. Top 3 in the Mountain Dew League online season, top 2 in the Headshot Cup, top 2 in the EU Minor Open qualifier for Krakow, top 3 in the Hellcase Cup number 4, and first place in the Farm Skins Championship. And these are all tournaments that initially on the surface don't seem like your ESL 1s, and don't seem like your ESL Pro Leagues, and definitely they're not kind of to that level. But I'd still argue that these online competitions are still major stepping stones for a lot of tier 2 teams, and still definitely one of the still sporting quite a decent amount of talent and a decent team roster in those particular tournaments. So to see Penta go through all those online events and just get top 2, top 3, top 4, first place in a lot of those cases was pretty fantastic for them. And their LAN scene wasn't quite as good, but still pretty reputable. They got first place at the Mountain Dew Global Challenge, which is a pretty major thing if you do ask me. That's just your first LAN. A first LAN for Penta Sports, first place, huge start of things. Their second LAN was the GeForce Cup, came bottom 8, which is a pretty bad performance considering they went out to the Gatekeepers. Who haven't really got any reputable names on their roster. They're a Swedish team, or they were a Swedish team at the time, who just didn't really have any major players at that time. Then they came second at the EU Minor Krakow, which is great. Top 8 at the Krakow Major Qualifier, which is even better. And then the final round appearance would be at the Krakow Major, of course. 12th to 14th would be their overall finish. So not in the top 8, unfortunately, going out as challengers. And it was a pretty difficult time for them as well, because in that particular major they lost to SK Gaming, and they lost against North, and they lost against Flipside. SK Gaming at the time were the best team in the world. I'd still argue they probably are one of the 2 best teams in the world right now. North were in top form at the time. A ridiculous Danish roster, and Flipside, who still had an electronic in the team, who was carrying hard basically for that entire team until Navi eventually picked him up. So their only victory was against Vega Squadron, who weren't anywhere near the upsetters that they are now. So it is a shame for Penta to go out in that particular regard, but you know, I don't think I was expecting major things out of them. I think when that major rolled around, I personally was putting Penta to go into the top 8, but I feel like that was a very ambitious pick, and I definitely feel like I wasn't expecting that one to go all the way. So I'm not too surprised that that's where they got at within just such a short space of time as well. That kind of placement to go from nothing straight up to the major is pretty impressive, if you do ask me. And I take a look at this run, and I take a look at these results, and I'm thinking that if they had kept it going for maybe another 6 months, maybe another 6 months to a year, then we probably could have been seeing a borderline Tier 1 team. You know, it's some pretty impressive results for just a short time span. And I definitely don't believe that this was a flash in the pan kind of thing as well, because, you know, they had some up and down moments where they were going ham and overperforming like mad, and they had some tournaments where they weren't really performing at all. And I feel like that, you know, it is a testament to the state that just a couple of issues that for Penta Sports, they still were a mortal team. They just had a lot of potential, and a lot of that potential translated into their rivalries. And one of these rivalries was up against another squad who came from a very, very similar background called BIG, or the Berlin International Gaming Organization. BIG were similar to their in their rags to riches background as Penta. They started off as a roster, had a broken, completely dismantled team that had just left another German organization, and then they rebuilt back. They were signed by BIG. They formed BIG together, and they were rebuilding back into the formidable. They were being like, you know, rebuilding themselves to a formidable force in the upper echelons of CS:GO. And in that case, you've got 2 sides that have done the exact same thing, essentially. They're fighting for supremacy over their Tier 2 top spot, essentially. And over the course of the few months that Penta was together and BIG had just got their start, both of these sides would clash in several online and offline games that honestly was an absolute joy to watch from not only a fan's perspective, but as a commentator as well. The first one was a 16-14 close scoreline on Mirage in the Mountain Dew League season 24. It was a regular season match. It was online. It was mostly that close thanks to a lagging BIG side and a below average performance from like Leggy and Godby and Tabson and Kiev. Kiev was actually hard carrying throughout that entire game, but Leggy, Godby, and Tabson were particularly poor during that particular match. Both sides were still quite new at the time. They're still quite figuring themselves out. Key was hard carrying for BIG. Over on Penta, Sunny and HS were going pretty ham, so it was kind of a big clash between the main star from one and the 2 stars from the other, because Sunny was very, very well represented. HS, not the most represented, but still had quite the amount of young talent on that particular roster. And I think that Penta really should have won that one. It was 16-14 to the favor of BIG instead. And I think Penta definitely had the better performance overall. It's just that BIG were able to keep up just by a little bit and edged them out at the very, very last second. And it is a league play game. It doesn't have a major amount of significance, and I don't think it should be looked at as a major key point in this particular rivalry, but it would set us up for a match that we will see many, many times over. As I said, you know, they met each other in many best of 3s and many best of 1s and many series, both online and offline. Which, of course, leads us to our first offline matchup between these two, and it was the Mountain Dew Playoff semi-finals. Actually, scratch that, sorry, the Mountain Dew Playoffs was actually an online tournament, excuse me. And it was the first best of 3 that we would see between these 2 squads, however. It was Inferno, Cash, and Mirage as the maps. We'd already seen Mirage, obviously, 16-14, a very, very close score. And if it went to Mirage, then it would have been extremely close as well. Penta would take the first map, Inferno, pretty confidently, 16-8. I think at the time, Big didn't really have Inferno on their repertoire. I don't think that it was a very good map for Big. But HS and Sunny were proving to perform as well again against the Big side, backed up by a very solid performance from Innocent. And Big had Tabson going ham this time, but no other players really posted very good numbers from that Big squad. So between that first map and the second map, things definitely needed to change. And Big were able to back them up back up the entire team during Cash, which would become much more closer, but Big would win it out 16-11. Legia was the man that was really stepping up in this one, outperforming basically every other player in the server from Penta and Big, which lead us on to Mirage, which already Big had won prior to this on the online season. And the final scoreline was just as close. 16-13 was the end of it. But in this case, it would actually be Big to win that one out. And it was mostly thanks to the fact that Penta just kind of dropped off as the series went on through. Crystal, Innocent, and Zen in this particular map were among the bottom 4 performers in the whole server. And Legia kept up his performance from Cash to outperform basically every player from the Penta side. And Big also did a very good job of keeping up with him, supporting him, getting frags on the board, and just doing well to shut down Penta in every manner of form. So once again, so far 2 for 2, Big will be able to take 2 wins against Penta, but Penta still in the third place decider matchup would take the top 3 in the playoff series for Mountain Dew League and go to the Global Challenge MDO LAN, which actually sets up our next meeting for these guys. Really the first offline meeting between these two squads. The first time we see them on LAN, their second best of 3 series overall. The maps for this one, the veto, were Kashmir, Inferno, and Mirage, and we've already seen all of these at this point, so we've already got a decent shout as to what happened. But it still was a very close affair across the board from all sides. 16-11 was still a close scoreline. 16-13, those were the maps. Those were Cash and Mirage, and we were going to see Cash first and Mirage last. So we already had to look at things in that kind of regard. And Cash was actually stolen away from Penta to kick off this series. 16-13, their stars really stole the show on this first map. They got Sunny, Innocent, and HS. They were the top 3 performers in this map, and they did absolutely fantastic. But Sunny was the man who outperformed everybody. 35 kills to 18 on this map, and he just did absolute wonders for Penta in that particular game. It was absolutely incredible from him just to show up, and I think that if he was able to show up during the entire I think that Sunny had a really good time overall in Penta, and if he was able to show up, then he would have been able to crack that monster Penta that I think would have been able to perform to such a ridiculous extent. But we'll get to that later on during the video. The only major letdown for them in this map was really Crystal and Zen, because both players were bottom 3 in this map, and if they were able to keep up with the rest of them, then I feel like that maybe this would have been a much far gone scoreline for them, because, you know, at the end of the day, it was the 16-13 performance. It was still extremely close. If Crystal and Zen had kept up, then it could have been a really easy map for Penta, but it got unnecessarily close because of that, and as a result, there was still a decent chance for Big to take Inferno. Fortunately, Penta had a very close map again, and they just about stole it away at 16-12. 2 players from each team were in the top 4 performers. Crystal and stepped up. Innocent was there. Tabson and Legia for Big were up in the top 4 sort of regions. And it was ridiculous. It was such a big fight between all the major players from both sides. The big thing for the big issue for Big, however, is that Kiev, Godby, and Nex were the bottom 3 performers in this particular map. Nex only got 11 kills throughout that whole map, and they let down the likes of Tamsin and Legia, which really was what gave Penta another close shave victory against Big. Big mainly only, you know, were able to claim these close scorelines like 16-12, 16-11 because they were very good at working like a team, and they still kind of are good like working at a team, working like a team. So seeing them kind of come together in that kind of regard was really, really inspiring. But in the end, Penta's sort of firepower really outpaced Big on LAN. And in the end, it was Penta to claim the Global Challenge title with 2 close maps and the first place finish at Mountain Dew League. We move on to EPL and their Season 5 relegation matches. Because both sides came in the top 3 during the online playoffs for Mountain Dew League, they were invited to the EPL relegation matches to try for a spot in the Pro League for Season 6. And that's kind of how it works. That's what the Mountain Dew League is. It's a feeder league for the ESL Pro League, and that's how it works. So seeing these two teams, they were up against Virtus Pro and Hellraisers, the not the bottom two, but the two above the last place player, the last place team in that one, which I think was Kingwin at the time. I can't remember specifically, but I definitely know that obviously it was Hellraisers and Virtus Pro versus Big and Penta. Double elimination bracket. Penta took on Hellraisers, and they actually ended up losing to drop to the lower bracket. Big would defeat Virtus Pro, knocked them against Penta in the lower bracket. And Penta would actually 2-0 VP to relegate them back to MDL. Virtus Pro at this time were a far cry from the team that they once were back when Innocent was part of Team Kingwin. And we know that obviously because of the state that Virtus Pro are in right now, because this is sort of like the start of it. This is where they were relegated. This is about the same sort of period where people were saying, is Virtus Pro still a top team? Are they still worthy of being put in the top 10? We don't really know. We don't really think so. A lot of people don't really imagine that being the case. And this was the first instance where they actually lost one of their professional, their top tier placements in league play. So Penta would 2-0 them. VP performed absolutely awful. And then Big would also lose to Hellraisers in the upper match, 2-1 in the series to set up one more meeting against Penta in the decider match. Winner would go to the Pro League. Loser would be back in MDL for another season. And the maps were Inferno, Cobble, and Mirage. Cobble being a new sort of map for these guys. Obviously, Inferno and Mirage we've already seen several different times. It's common ground for this rivalry. Penta had won Inferno 2 out of 2 times at this point over the course of their series, and they were expected to win this first one as well. Cobblestone was really the main contention point for this series. At least that's what we all thought going into this series. The truth is that everyone shit the bed from Penta, and I mean everyone. Like the 5 players of Penta were in the bottom half. No one broke through the good tier in terms of the HLTV ratings. If you take a look at their rating 2.0, if you take a look at their match back on their page, you know, all of them were just, you know, just not performing at all. And meanwhile on Big, Tabson was just, you know, performing ridiculous. 16-8 was the scoreline. Big destroyed Penta, and there was very little hope for them going into Cobblestone. Like, we're looking at their form, just like, what on earth is going on? This is looking disastrous, essentially, from the Penta lineup. And then Big would go on to win Cobblestone. Admittedly, it was an overtime victory, 90-17. Penta managed to get themselves back together, but it was still too little too late, and they didn't perform much better than map 1 because they still had 4 players in the bottom 5, which is a shame for Sunny because, you know, he was in the top 3. And I think that's really what really kind of boosted Sunny to the point of getting picked up by Mouse Sports. Because one thing I'll take a look at a lot of the series from Penta is that whenever they were losing, Sunny was always performing, but the rest of the team weren't really keeping up with him, and that's really what the main issues with the losses were. Sunny was always on point, always on perfection, and Penta just weren't able to keep up with him as a result. So Big take their first best of 3 series win against Penta, not on land, unfortunately, online. Sorry, that is not their first best of 3 series win. That is actually their second best of series win. I don't know why it says my first best of 3. I've clearly made a major mistake in my notes, but we'll just move on from that. Pretend I never said that at all. And the next time they would meet would be in the EU Minor Closed Qualifier. This was online. Once again, Big were invited to the closed qualifier just due to how notable they were at the time under an organisation that had been very, very reputable and made their way up very, very quickly. I feel like there was a lot of issues and a lot of problems when it comes, or I think there was a lot of unfair treatment when it comes to Big and Penta and the way that they were invited or had to qualify for certain tournaments, because Big were invited quite a lot and Penta had to qualify for a lot of other things, because I don't think a lot of people really saw Penta as its main staple roster in that sort of like tier 2 region. I think that's very unfair, because I think the Penta, well, I'm on the Penta hype train, right? Lots of people were riding Big and like, yeah, they are big dogs. They are forces to be reckoned with. I was all about Penta at the time. And Penta for this particular tournament had to qualify through the open qualifier while Big were invited. They still managed to have a very good run for this one. It was a Swiss system, group, so 3 victories and you're through to the EU Minor. And they actually met each other when they were 2-0 up in the top group. 1 match, 1 more win to qualify, and the map was Inferno. Penta, already known over history to be good on this map against Big, and this was the case that they actually did show up this time. 16-9 was to the favour of Penta. Much better performance. Zen, HS Sunny, all playing well. And this Penta looked very, very unstoppable. In my eyes, it's the kind of performance of what I coined the Monta Penta Sports. I mentioned this earlier in the video. I think that if they had the opportunity to unlock this kind of performance and actually recreate it consistently, then I feel like Penta could have been an unstoppable force, similar to the ilk of Space Soldiers during their heyday back in early 2017 and late 2016. I feel like if they were able to step up to that kind of a level, and if Penta were able to unlock that kind of a level in their own right, then I think they could have dominated the Tier 2 scene and maybe even pushed up to the Tier 1 scene. They looked unstoppable then. They took 3-0. They would progress to the EU Minor. But Big would also go to the EU Minor because in the next round they would win out with a 3-1 record and, of course, go to the Minor LAN. But before we get to the Minor LAN, there was one more online competition which they took part in, and they both faced off in the Grand Finals event, and that was the first FarmSkins Championship. I personally was involved with this project. I commentated for the FarmSkins Championship basically from the start of the group stage, and I did the Grand Finals alongside my good friend Seaside. Big up to you, my friend. And it was a pretty epic tournament because there was quite a lot of good teams in it. $25,000 of prize pool and 2 spots up for grabs in the WCA 2017 tournament. Both teams already had their spots going into the finals because it was for the top 2, but this was for the cash, and as well as that, a rivalry for bragging rights was, you know, it was a pretty big deal for both sides once again, because, you know, they've met each other so many times in the past. Meeting each other one more time, it just felt like it was so appropriate that this be the Grand Finals for the FarmSkins Championship, and I was hyped. I know the desk was hyped because we were building into this particular storyline pretty significantly at the time, and seeing where it was going to go was always going to be great. So the map vetoes were Cobblestone first, Train second, and Cash as the decider map, and we already were going to be seeing new ground already. Train was a new one, similar to the way that Cobblestone was the new map in one of the first few series that we saw them perform at. It was going to be an interesting time to see how well Penta would perform against Big and vice versa on Train. We already knew where Cobble was going to go. I think I predicted Penta to take a 2-1 scoreline, if I remember correctly. And for this particular map, they took the first map 16-11. Prior to this, Penta had already lost Cobble in the EPL relegation due to the underperformance, and that's something I kind of wanted to focus on as well, because like it definitely proves that Penta, when they're performing, can really overcome any challenges. 4 players in the top 4 performances, which is again proving to the monster Penta that I was mentioning earlier. I definitely feel like that this team, if they were able to unlock that same sort of consistent performance, would have done this in so many other series, in so many other different tournaments. And 16-11 was just, you know, the way that they took Cobblestone. 16-13 would be on Train, and this one was also to the Penta. Never really been a good map for Big. I know that for a fact. It really kind of showed here. Next was the only real band to perform. The other 4 in the bottom 5. And Penta took the match and the first place prize, not convincingly against Big, but definitely a good victory for them nonetheless. And thus, Penta wins out yet another series against Big in this rivalry. Now, the penultimate time that we would see them, actually no, this would be the last time, excuse me, was the EU Minor Grand Final. Both teams once again in the final. It was an appropriate final for an appropriate LAN. This would be the last This would be the last time that these two would face off. They would never meet each other in the major, and they'd never meet each other in online competition again. Both of them made it to the major already by this point. Again, similar to how it was in the FarmSkins Championship, but they were hunting the minor title, which is a little bit more important than the FarmSkins Championship, and the increased prize pool, and of course the overall bragging rights for the rivalry, because Big are in a position where they could not only have taken the series lead, but also the map lead above Penta Sports. So seeing them in this situation obviously was a very big thing for the rivalry, and it was an exciting match. A lot of people were expecting this one to be really, really good. The maps were Train, Overpass, and Cobblestone. We hadn't seen Overpass yet, so once again another new ground to be broken when it comes to these two teams of rivalry. And Train went in, everyone was hyped, and then Penta shit the bed. 16-3 was the first map on Train. Overpass went Big's way, 16-6. Penta just did not turn up. Just absolutely shit the bed, essentially. I'm not sure whether that was because they were already happy in making it to the major, or whether they were just woke up on the wrong side of the bed that morning. It was a series that represented what I believe to be the start of the deadly slump for this Penta team that they never really could recover from. And that's how we're going to close out the video today. But it was a very disappointing end to what would have been a fantastic hurrah for Penta, and big as a result. Taking the series and taking it 2-0 means that actually they would end up winning. They would end up winning the rivalry pretty definitively. 3-2 in series victories, 7-6 in map victories. It was a close. Very close affair, but in the end, Big would prove to be the victors of that rivalry, and would also prove to be the victors overall when it comes to their roster staying together, because as we know, Penta fell into the slump after the major, and they never recovered from it. The whole team collapsed. The remainders went on to form what we now know as Sprout, and various other players would move on to greener pastures, or at least they would hope to be greener pastures. Penta, of course, following the minor, came into the top 8 of the major qualifier, and then when in the Swiss system they went out 1-3 in that particular group. Afterwards, they were unable to qualify for a LAN, mainly because they were unable to make top 3 in Mountain Dew League again. They were unable to make deep runs in qualifiers again, and they never received any of the LAN invites. And really, when you're relying on making good runs through qualifiers and leagues to get to LAN, receiving no LAN invites is not a pretty sight. The only LAN they attended was the Omen Challenge at Gamescom 2017. At least I think it was Gamescom. I definitely remember it being one of these conventions that Omen likes to do their show match challenges. But it is a show match tournament. Even by this point, the roster has started to fall apart. I think they already lost Sunny as the first man. And of course, they would never make a top 4 placement ever again in this particular form, except for the Omen Challenge, which doesn't really count because there were 4 teams participating anyway. Slowly but surely, the team would be picked apart by various different reasons, whether that be just falling out or being brought out. Sunny was the first man and got acquired by Mouse Sports, and then Mouse Sports would take him, use him, fit them into their roster, and go to a point where they would be one of the most reputable teams in all of EU. Even to the point now that he's still part of Mouse Sports. Right now, they are playing currently on Mirage in the Star Ladder tournament, 3-1 to the favor of Liquid. Might be about to go 3-2. Nope, 4-1. So, but yeah, no, they are still competing together. Sunny's been a very good player for them. I think one of the among sort of like the top 3 in that roster when it comes to raw performance numbers and metrics. So Sunny picked up by Mouse Sports, started out here. HS will also get picked up by Optic EU after their North American lineup fell through. So Penta had been reduced to their main 3, Crystal, Zen, and Innocent. And Penta would try and stay alive. They had Narsu subbing in, their coach, and they had a couple other players subbing in and subbing out, trying to establish a new core 5. But eventually Narsu would move to Godsend as the coach for that particular squad, and Penta realized that this roster was falling apart once again, similar to the way things started off in 2017. That's how they were going to end 2017. And in this case, they just didn't want to continue with it. They decided it would best if they released their remaining players, and Crystal, Zen, and Innocent would go on to join forces with 2 other Germans, Dennis and Speedy, recreate a majority German roster, and form Seed, which we now know as Sprout. And it is a bit of a sad end to the way that Penta kind of fell apart, because, when they went into their slump, they never really got the chance to get going again. And I feel like if the opportunities didn't come through from Mouse Sports and Optic, if they didn't decide to buy Sunny, if they didn't decide to buy HS, I feel like that if they'd stuck it out through this slump, they could have, probably not made it through all the way to the new major in Boston. But I think that they had a decent shout to maybe make it up to the minor for Boston, the EU minor. Already there was a lot of potential just going into this lineup to kick things off. The 3 already accomplished players and players who had the best brought out in them, as was proved over the course of this roster's run. The worst of players in this team had, ridiculous talent brought out of them thanks to the leadership from Crystal and the way that this roster was overall performed. And I feel like that, unfortunately for them, that has kind of died. Obviously, HS is now out of the EU Optic lineup, and Optic have gone for the Danish lineup. Sunny, of course, was already pretty rawly talented. He's on Mouse Sports, but Innocent as well, and Crystal and Zen haven't really been able to accomplish much, and I feel like that's because they lost out on 2 of their big players, of course. There were consistency issues with this roster, obviously, but when they were on point, they were scary good. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think that unlocking this form, if I think that one of the trying to crack the secret of being able to find this monster Penta that I've mentioned so much, really would have been the key to pushing Penta into a top 15 and top 10 ranking overall, in my opinion. I feel like they were capable of it. I feel like there was a good opportunity for it. And yeah, I might be looking at this through rose-tinted glasses, but that's just the way that I feel. This lineup, I think, could have been a force to be reckoned with. Maybe not within the top echelons of the elites. I definitely don't feel like they've got world-beater players, except for maybe Sonny. But I definitely feel like they would have held a good fight. And I definitely feel like that they had a long way to go. And I definitely think that if they were still here today, then they would probably be one of the teams to look out for in the Tier 2 and the borderline Tier 1 regions.